Hey there, and welcome back to From His to Hot. I'm excited for the next episode on our fake news series, and I'm with Syed Shuva, who's a PhD candidate at the very prestigious University of Arkansas, one of the top schools for information systems. Syed's an aspiring academic, and he's got a lot of interesting things to say. We met at a conference earlier this year, and I thought, man, it'd be nice to get someone who's at a similar stage in their journey and kind of get their thoughts. Someone who's been brought up within the system, but also maybe has some thoughts that are not as well addressed by it currently. Welcome, Syed.
Thank you so much, Michael, for inviting me. And it's I was surprised when you invited me for the podcast. I'm like, you should be inviting I don't know, more accomplished people.
Uh,
But I totally agree that sometimes it's just good to talk to your peers. Like, and I really enjoyed the last conversation we had at the conference. The timing didn't work out, but I'm just glad to, catch up now.
mhm. Yeah. So before we jump into like the questions and stuff, and we'll ask Syed about his background, we're going to be talking, probably having multiple conversations at once. So I hope that different audiences can enjoy this at different levels. There will be the fact that we're both PhD candidates, and we're going to lament about some of the stuff that we see going on and how we like to change some things. Probably in particular with fake news research, but also, the dynamics of, hey, you meet at a conference. What is that like? We met in the Big 12 in my symposium earlier this year. I still have the
Yep.
pamphlet off to the side. And I was in the fortunate but somewhat terrifying position that every student fears. This was my first conference in the academic realm, where I was the last conference on the last day, and there was no other conferences going along in parallel. I think it was the only one like that. So anyone who stuck around to the end was in that room. And I very much appreciated Syed's comments after the talk, which were, first of all, very good in terms of like being aware of the bigger picture of fake news. I was presenting a game theory model for a simpler, smaller slice of fake news. And he was asking the big picture questions. And I thought, it is refreshing to hear an academic who does not presuppose that we know everything that we need to know about fake news and is looking at the different kind of forms it can take and the difficulties in operationalizing, diagnosing, having prescriptions, and studying fake news. So we had a great conversation. Syed, I agree. It was a little pressed for time because it was very much end of presentation. Okay, shuffle everyone out. Everyone's got to get home. You had a little further to go than I did, getting back to Arkansas. I just had to go back down to Houston. But yeah, it was a blast.
Yes, and now I remember that your presentation was actually probably the last presentation of the session.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was almost a packed room.
I
It
tried not
was
to focus on
quite
that
a,
part.
yes, it was quite a because like normally what I do is I take the pamphlets or they send out the schedule up ahead, and I usually mark the talks that I would like to attend, and yours one was like, I am not missing this
Oh, well,
because the topic was very interesting and also in the realm of my interests as
mhm.
well. And that, the sort of the packed room, it kind of signifies that yes, the people in the IAS are really interested in the topic because no one is rushing out because usually you see as the conference ends people tend to depart, they have other commitments,
Mhm.
but a lot of people stayed back and attended, and I think there were so many questions, like
Mhm.
you know not just okay, the questions were, I think, you stimulated
Mhm.
the discussions. The people were like actually asking good questions,
Yeah.
right? It was not like methodological question, why did
Mhm.
you do this?
Right.
No, it
Yeah.
was like the big, everyone was asking very big questions, and I was like, oh my God,
Mhm.
this is a very, very good. I was really impressed with your presentation,
Mhm.
and yeah,
Well, thank you.
I really hope you're doing great things with it now.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. I'll be giving a very similar talk in actually next month. We're recording in September 2023. I'll be at Informs in October to present the same paper. It's evolved, as you would imagine, a bit since then. Thanks in part to some of that good feedback, actually. But yeah, I mean, it's very kind words that you extended. I did feel somewhat fortunate. I thought it's a 50-50 chance. Maybe people will just rush out and I'll only have to present to like the people I carpooled with, and that'll be great because it'll be like, less stressful. And then the other side of me was like, well, maybe, you know, if more people are there, then it makes the paper stronger because you get more feedback. But to the extent it was successful, you know, I work hard, I would like to think anyway, but, you know, I stand on the shoulders of giants as we all do, I think. But, you know, with my dissertation advisor, Ravi Aaron, spark, a kindling for the idea, came from a guy named Dr. Marshall Van Alstyne up in Boston. Spoiler alert, we're trying to get him on this for this series as well. So you talked about people who are quote unquote more accomplished. We're just junior in our career, so we don't have extremely long publication records. And I question whether that's a signal of intellectual contributions anymore. Perhaps it still is in information systems, but in academia more broadly, I have my doubts. I'm not speaking for Syed, but I have my doubts. But
Yeah.
okay. All right. So Syed, there's a couple questions that I'm going to try and tee up for all of our guests, and I hope I can remember them for each person. But I'm going to start with the thing that is most simple but not easy to answer. What is fake news?
Yes, and I think that's something we discussed right after your presentation. We can't define it. There is frankly no way to define what is fake news. I'm not, I'm quite sure that you're not asking me to define the academic definition of fake news that there are in papers. Those are those definitions are I like because it's a good way to conceptualize, right? But the way I see it, or the way I kind of conceptualize it so I can study it, is there are two dimensions of fake news. One is the sort of the objectivity, or how much facts do you have in the news, right? And it can be the level of the amount of facts that's verifiable, right? And I don't see as a dichotomous, it's on a continuum, right? So there is a way to package a news where you have facts, and also mixed with fiction, right? You can have that. So that I see that as a continuum. And then another dimension is the deception, the deception element to it, right? So you can have facts as well as mixed with deceptions. You only have facts, no fiction, but the way you package the facts is to deceive the reader. So even that deception element, I see that as on a continuum, right? And again, that's just way for me to study it, right?
Yeah, you have to simplify it before you can study it. Agreed.
So that's a lot of assumption, a lot of simplification. And, for me, it's not, the problem is not defining fake news. The problem is defining news. What is news?
Yes. So that's kind of where the cliffhanger we left off at the end of the conference. And I want to get your thoughts on that because I've studied much more in the PhD kind of game theory and construct validity, data-driven ways to try and get construct validity around fake news particularly, whereas you have a much more, I would say, you have a wider kind of frame for this, and you're looking at, okay, well, fake and versus news, like clearly we're implying a distinction, otherwise we'd use the same term. And there's good reasons we can talk about some of the leading researchers. They talk about the importance of being able to account for both. There are, as I had indicated, there's a couple of things. One, there's like many challenges with defining this. There's also a diversity of definitions in the literature. So I wonder, I have two questions, and you can take these in either order. One is, how appropriate do you think it is for people to make claims about fake news research findings, or kind of pound their chest about research and fake news when there's not even agreement among quote unquote experts, the people doing the primary research about what constitutes fake news? So that's one question. And then two, and by the way, I know that you're going on the job market in academia. You're more than welcome to plead the fifth. I won't hold that against you. Okay. I think that's an honest response back to your deception point. The second question is, I'm with you on the degree of factuality of news. Like that's clearly some component of what people talk about when they mean fake news. And your other point, which is deception, this deals with like the intentionality of the author. That is something that is common generally, but not universal to the different definitions people will use for fake news. And so the second question I have is, if I give you a piece of news, I know how you could go about, well, I think I know about how you could go about getting a measure of objectivity. How can you go about getting a measure of deception? So again, the two questions are, what would you say about researchers making grand claims when we have a lack of convergence on what fake news is? And the second is, how would you measure deception in an article, one of your primary dimensions for how you study fake news?
So I'll start with the first question,
Mhm.
right? Like people making grand claims or
Mhm.
researchers making grand claims. I think the good papers that I follow, or the big scholars that I've spoken to who are into the fake news realm,
Mhm.
I believe, based on my experience of speaking to them, is they know that their findings are limited
Mhm.
by the context, limited even by the measurements they have used. So I would say, like, I don't think anyone can make grand claims about uh, research on fake news. At least even in like so there was this three series of articles published recently in Science,
Mhm.
and it's all related to fake news and misconsumption and political polarization.
Mhm.
And they actually collaborated with Facebook. So Facebook actually opened their platform to researchers. It's one of their transparency initiative.
Mhm.
And so this is like a big research team that uh, did, like, field experiments, survey, and collected real data,
Mhm.
like real engagement data from
Mhm.
Facebook. And even they don't claim, because they actually do a field experiment,
Mhm.
and like actual like people real Facebook users, they actually get the treatment. So that's probably the best way to establish causality, right?
Yeah.
And even they don't claim that,
Mhm.
if you read their, so they don't claim that. And I think all of us, we should not be doing that. If uh, I know that, whatever fake news research I'm doing is extremely limited by the context.
Mhm.
And we just need to do cumulative work, and hopefully someday, through enough engagement with industry and more importantly, the social media platforms and the news media, maybe we can find a solution. And this is not something that only IAS scholars can do. It
Sure.
requires a concerted effort from all disciplines, right?
Mhm.
So I'm not convinced if anyone tries to make grand claims about
Same.
fake news, in
Yeah.
short.
Yeah, I think that's great. It's a very honest answer. I think there's a lot of insight and wisdom there. Some people would probably contend with, well, we're taking these very rigorous techniques to a problem, so we should be able to say more than someone who hasn't. I'm somewhat sympathetic to that argument, but again, I have this very um, kind of large weight on the context dependency and the way people operationalize their studies. A field experiment with a platform is certainly better than many techniques, to be sure. But I have, and we'll talk more today and with some other guests about this problem, because I don't want to put the entire weight of answering this question on you. I mean, though just did, it's good to get your informed opinion on it. Okay, so the idea that it's provisional knowledge, as all science is. Maybe this is something we can talk about in a minute, because I do want to give you a chance to answer the other question. But essentially, the idea that fake news, you can do some research and make some claims, is not offensive to me. What is offensive to me is those who use the fact that they've conducted research of some varying quality to then advocate for large scale social prescriptions as a singular point of authority or as a point of authority from a very small index of like-minded individuals. And that, I think, instills distrust, which makes the quote unquote fake news problem worse, because it's as if you have an intervention, you have a series of proposed interventions that now the populace is a substantial portion of the populace, not always the same portion, but many people have been inoculated such that that intervention will not be effective in the real world. In a lab experiment, perhaps it's different.
I totally agree with you on that. Sometimes, every paper has a limitation section, right?
Yep.
And before making any like overarching policy suggestions or making prescriptions on what the society should do, what social media platforms should do, or what regulations we can have, we need to look at what are the limitations of the study itself, right?
Yeah.
And there has to be multiple studies to actually validate the findings, because it's so context specific. It's so context specific, right? Like, I'll just give you one example. And I mean, my paper has not been published yet. I'll probably be sending it for review. But there's something I did for my, this is a fake news paper. And one thing that I was surprised from reading the political science research articles is that like when individuals engage in, like, let's say, confirmation bias or motivated reasoning, as we say, the driving factor is their attitude towards that issue, right? So we often take control. We often control for their ideology, political ideology, but we don't actually capture, or not a lot of studies capture. Okay, you can have varying attitude towards different issues. Like, let's say, for example, you might have a very strong position on climate change, right? And but we cannot say that, okay, all people from the right has this attitude towards climate change, right?
Sure.
That's a generalization that we make. But those the attitudes itself, like, it's very issue specific, and sometimes I've seen papers do not control for that, because there's also two sides to that attitude, which also has not been as well explored. So there's these two elements of attitude towards the topic. One is called, like, one is like the polarity of it, like how much how extreme you are, and then the other part is the strength, like how much how convinced are you about that position, right?
Sure.
So let's say you can have a very neutral position on climate change, but your position is very strong, right?
Yeah.
So that is different than someone who is neutral, but probably they don't feel as strongly about that.
Yeah.
Right. So these are things that we often, sometimes, depending on the context, we need to control for. We need to see how our interventions are conditioned by these factors. So that's just one example where I have found those things to be quite important. And there is, like, political in psychology and political science, there's literature from 90s and 2000s that have shown that, yes, that matters a lot.
Yeah. I mean, the study of attitudes, I mean, even in IS, which is a relatively new field, and I'll save my diatribe for why I don't think IS is a singular discipline, but so much as like a meta context for studies in the 21st century for another day. But even in IS, it's been decades where attitudes generally have been studied. And so the idea that there's different facets of what composes an attitude or what underpins an attitude seems eminently reasonable. And I agree, if you just have a crude measure of political affiliation, that's not ideal. Even if you have a measure of attitude of belief without having the strength of belief, that's also less ideal. And so as we try and tease these things apart, that's important. I agree with you. So for people who hate academic jargon, I mean, we kind of throw certain words around and they might not appreciate kind of what we mean. So when you say context, everything is context, you're not saying everything is context, but you say so much in the study of news and fake news depends on the context. What do you mean by that?
So one simple example is, what type of articles are you giving? So let's say I'm talking about an experiment, right?
Okay.
So the context could be, what topic of articles are you giving them, right? So like that's why that attitude about the issue. So if you're giving them only articles about climate change, then maybe it's good to capture how they feel about climate change before you actually show them those articles. And then the presentation of the articles, the presentation format, right? If you're giving only headlines versus you're giving them headlines and pictures and maybe some text, does that has anything to do with how people respond, right? If you're, I understand there are a lot of studies have done headlines, right? But in a social media platform, along with headlines, you do get some snippets of text. You also get a picture, and sometimes if it's shared by someone else, you get some commentary,
right? Yeah.
Right? So the source is coming from, whether it's from a friend, right? It's someone you trust. Let's say I trust your opinion, and you shared something, and I probably will not care what the source is. I'll at least look at the article and make my opinion about it, right? So I think that's just one example of what I mean by context. And I mean, a lot of good papers do a very good job of explaining what the contexts are and how their findings are limited by these conditions. And we try to make it as applicable or have more external validity. I'm again using a jargon, but the idea is, we want to make it more generalizable so that our findings can be applicable. But it's not possible to implement that in single studies. We know, like you have design. If you have design studies, it's very difficult to say that, okay, my findings apply for everything in fake news.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. I need to make it manageable, and then brick by brick, I'll have to put the pieces together. It's like you get one piece of knowledge, and then you get another piece, and you glue them together. And same like what other people are doing, you glue everything together, and then you can probably make some generalizable suggestions.
Yep. No, I agree. You kind of, you plant trees and then you can zoom out. And if you've planted enough trees, you and your colleagues and people from different disciplines and think pieces from outside the academy, you can zoom out and then you say, okay, there is kind of a forest here, and we kind of see a pattern. And I'm with you. And IS, for the record, this is neither your fault nor mine. They should prioritize replication where they can, right? I understand certain, especially earlier in IS, that wasn't even remotely feasible, but as we know, social science broadly and certain segments very much suffer from replication issues. They're, the top journals, they've got replication rates between, 1 in 4 and 1 in 2. That's not science, really. I mean, that's at best, that's publishing of spurious findings that align with the reviewers and editors' predispositions at the time of review. That is the best case scenario. Again, speaking for myself, not Syed. Syed wants a job in academia.
No, I mean, we kind of hear, that is the system is not perfect, right? Sure. And hopefully, with time, we can fix it. But yeah, I mean, I haven't dealt with the big journals, MISQ, ISR yet. So, but I'll be submitting soon. So
Good luck. Fingers crossed, man.
I'll see how things are dealt, but I know how difficult it can be to navigate the journals, and and we just have to do our, put our best forward, and hopefully, the findings will stand the test of time. And it's interesting you mentioned about the replication. So we do have like a AIS transaction of replication research. There is a journal.
There you go.
But I think we also need to do more than just maybe one of the big journals may need to encourage where you can do a series of replications. Let's say you are doing a series of replication of fake news research.
Right.
And put the pieces together. You just don't do replication, but you extend them. Right. You're applying what other people have done.
Yep.
And you see what has worked, what doesn't work, and put the pieces together and make suggestions. And at least in the fake news, that would make sense.
Yes. Yeah.
I can't speak for other domain.
Yeah, that's okay. That's the only issue we're tackling right now, or making a small contribution to anyway. Yeah. So okay, I'm with you. All right. And again, best of luck with the submissions coming forward. We've both submitted to journals or conferences, and we'll be submitting to journals soon. Which is roller coaster. But it's kind of like it's the choreography you go through as an academic, to the extent whether other people should care about the inner workings of academia. Conversation for another day, but hopefully our academic friends will appreciate that we had this kind of aside. So I didn't want to let you off the hook too quickly, because I did ask you how you measure deception. And so enlighten me, please.
Yes. So deception, I have only designed, or like conceptually designed and put forth ideas together. And we did some with pilot data. So basically, I'm applying text analytics. That's probably one way to identify deception. So
can I ask one quick question there? Because text analytics can mean a lot of different things.
Yes.
So are you doing something like you're developing a predictive score for how deceptive this is going to be based on word inventories that are associated with deception?
Yes. So something along I'll simplify it. Something along the lines of like Luke, where you have made a dictionary of these words or these adjectives represent factual information, or to describe more factual incidents, whereas these are more flimsy words, which are more likely to be used for deception. Now, I haven't validated it, but that's an idea of how to quantify, because it's so subjective, right? We need to have some leeway to operationalize that. But one way would be that to use text analysis. Another would be where you actually have a series of experts, maybe rate a few articles, how deceptive they are, right? And then you can also use like something like Amazon MTurk or other crowdsourced platforms, where you actually hire experts, not the regular survey takers, but the experts. You train them on how to identify deception. You ask them to rate articles on deceptivity, and maybe then you train a predictive model to predict deception. That could be another approach. These are very similar to what people. This is nothing. This is not groundbreaking, because people have applied similar techniques in other domains.
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, you borrow methodologies. I mean, it's a tool that provides you the potential, anyway, to unlock some new insight. That I have no issue with that. I mean, we're not computer science researchers developing a new algorithm, for example. We want to appropriate and have some good conceptual logic that allows for the appropriation to map onto the context of our study. Because You're speaking to the choir on that, preaching to the choir on that one, man. I'm all about having a wide but robust methodological tool belt. I think that is the path forward for credible research in academia and industry. Yeah. So, okay. Have you read the paper? And by the way, when you hear me typing, because unfortunately I'm an amateur podcaster, so people are going to hear the keys go in the background. What I'm typing is things that I want to make sure that I include in the episode artifact. So you mentioned a series of papers in science. I'm going to make sure those are included. I have an Excel sheet with all the definitions I've come across in academia for fake news. That kind of stuff is going to be included. But when you're talking about this text analytics of, hey, these words tend to be associated with, again, not universal law, but they tend to be associated with factual statements, whereas these tend to be associated with more loose statements. That seems interesting to me. It kind of appeals to the quant side of me. The expert rating of things, I don't know, because I take a very skeptical lens of, though I genuinely do believe in expertise. I worry that expertise that is designated as opposed to earned is a way that the actual findings of fake news research and and we'll talk about this as we go on, the civic importance of a high quality news diet, by just designating people as experts, independent of their actual claims to expertise, you can corrupt this system not overnight, but over a very short course of time. And then you've, to borrow an adage, you've poisoned the well, because then people always are just going to be like, well, you did this, or people could, even if it's irrational, maybe they should have a Bayesian approach, always being willing to update, but they will, this very salient, negativity, or negative thing that happened will be more salient than any string of small positive victories that you can put forward. So the expert rating thing, I'm a little less sold on, but this gives us an opportunity to talk about one of the papers in fake news. Are you familiar with David Rand and Gordon Pennycook?
Yeah.
Okay. Probably obvious for everyone who's like listening, who is aware of the fake news literature. Like, they're the two most prolific, but I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. Did you read the Rand and Allen article? I believe she's his PhD student. I could be wrong, but they're co-authors on a couple of papers about kind of like wisdom of the crowd and crowdsourced fact checks versus expert source fact checks.
Yes. Is this okay? Well, I'm trying to recall. There was a paper in MISQ that actually delved into crowd intelligence. Yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly which paper. Because in my head, the crowd intelligence paper was an MISQ, but that's not the paper you're talking about.
No,
right?
they're researchers from psychology, but actually we can tie these two together, because probably maybe the paper you're talking about is a research note by a couple of authors who are from Harvard Business School. By the way, all these people have been invited on the podcast. So, like, to the extent that I have dozens of listeners who can publicly shame them into coming on, like, I want to talk about their ideas. But that was something like they were trying to measure bias and slant in Wikipedia versus Encyclopedia Britannica. And they were essentially data mining those sources and trying to come up with measures of political bias directionally, but also in terms of magnitude. Is that the paper that you remember?
No.
Oh, no.
But but it sounds very fascinating,
Okay. Well, kind of the synthesis of these articles, and feel free to caveat this with anything that you're bringing to the table that I'm unaware of or haven't touched. The synthesis of these articles is that there are differences between expert source versus crowdsourced assessments or provisions of information. Small caveat, I said I believe in genuine expertise. I'm not particularly interested in like crowdsourced instructions on how to perform open heart surgery. Okay, like, for sure. I am interested in crowdsourced interventions that speak to a pluralistic civic body. I don't think you get to just anoint, philosopher kings. That has a tendency towards tyranny. But in any case, the crowdsourced thing, the Wikipedia article, what they found was that, yeah, there was discrepancies between Wikipedia and Encyclopedia Britannica, which, by the way, I suspect have diminished given Wikipedia's new editorial norms. But the coolest two findings for me were that the number of revisions on a Wikipedia article reduced the extent of political bias, which was cool because it's kind of like the battling out of ideas. By the way, they focused on contested knowledge. So this is areas for which there's no single canonical way to describe what's happening. So this would be something like the death tax versus a wealth tax, illegal immigration versus undocumented citizens or undocumented peoples. So that kind of stuff. And so what they found is when they looked at the Wikipedia articles that this process of revision attenuated the bias. And they also found that though Wikipedia articles were more biased overall, they were much longer. And that on a per word basis, they were actually less biased than the expert articles, which was, now the effect size was somewhat small for some topics, less so for others. So that was cool. And then the Jennifer Allen and Rand paper, and I apologize, I'm sure that they have other co-authors, I'm just forgetting. They said essentially something like, you can get pretty high convergence between crowdsourced ratings and expert source ratings on quote unquote fake news. The way they always, well, not always, but often operationalize fake news is they use ground truth as a set of fact checks. We could talk about issues with that, why you might do that, why you might not do that. But in effect, what they found was, okay, there's a couple of findings. We can get relatively good convergence with fact checkers in general. It's less good if you look at just Republican or conservative users. I forget the term they use. But it's still like there's still a positive correlation there, less strong. And so this kind of like, they didn't say this, but one insight you might take away from this is, okay, well, we don't necessarily have to rely on like singular authoritative bodies to evaluate all information. You can kick this to the crowd maybe a bit and still have, to the extent fact checks are useful, relatively similar results. So those are kind of the things I was thinking about. So when you talk about potential text analytics for the deception element, and we move away from like the word list, like right, the word banks essentially to have some score, and you talk about article evaluations, what's the motivation for having an expert as opposed to just opening up to a general MTurk user base, for example?
Well, the idea is like to train a model, right? You need to have and people who are like grading the articles, they need to understand what deception is, right?
Okay.
And that's where the idea is. It's not like we'll be recruiting just experts, but people who can be trained. So I haven't worked out, okay, what's the criteria for inclusion, right? Who am I trying to get included? But the idea is, who can I train to understand deception?
Yes. Okay.
Because it's not feasible for a few of us to code hundreds of articles.
Yep.
Right. And so that's the idea. Like, who can I train? And then based on those training, who can help us? It's just like the qualitative approach, right? How qualitative studies have been done. But just taking a more crowdsourcing that, and where you train some people to be experts on understanding what deception is, give them solid examples.
Right? Okay, that is interesting. Okay, so I'm way more open to that. I think that's for whatever it's worth. Like, I mean, like you could just like be like, that guy's crazy when we get off of here. But that version of expertise, I think, is relevant for the domain, right? This is not, I'm recruiting from an editorial board at this newspaper or this broadcasting organization or a collection of them, and those will be my experts because they have a title that would indicate as such, independent of whether they do or don't live up to that title. I'm making no claims at this present moment. But what you're saying is, no, we want people who have the ability to learn to detect deception. And then we want to essentially have our entire rating body composed of individuals like that. So I'm with you. Okay. So last question on this front. You're going to have to show them examples, right?
Yeah.
To discriminate between those who can detect deception and those who cannot.
Yeah.
So to the extent you can, what does that look like? I'm I'm with you conceptually. I totally get it. I think it's good. Now, when you put the meat on the bones and are going to do it, you're handing them 2 articles. What's going to be the difference between those 2 articles that will map onto deception? How would you do that?
So ideally, like let's say we will have a group of researchers who understand deception, and we will independently code few articles.
Okay.
We compare our coding and discuss about them. And based on what we have coded and deliberated a lot and spend a lot of time in picking it out, like, why is this deception and why is this not deception? So we can use those examples to actually, it's not like something that, okay, I feel this is deception and I'm just gonna, well, no, it should be a collaborative approach first among researchers, and then you train, you make the knowledge somewhat palatable to a more not the general, but somewhere in the middle, like people who can understand the bits and pieces of, okay, this feels like deception, this doesn't feel like deception. And it's again, this is this is something that I was very fascinated years ago, a year ago, and I had thought about it. I had even presented a trio about it, but not it's because in my as you I have discussed with you, I'm not tackling fake news for my dissertation.
Right.
I'm looking at a similar problem, so this idea is still on hold, right? And I'm sure I'll be happy if if it's I'll be happy to get it. I know there'll be a lot of people who'll be sad if someone actually does it, but I'll be happy because I care more about the idea and see that, okay, if it has currency, and I'm just interested to try it out. I cannot claim that it'll work, but conceptually, based on the literature I have read and based on some literature on deception and literature on fake news, to me, it seemed a bit logical, and also it like I mean, I know we're researchers and we need to limit or separate ourselves from our own biases and while we're doing research. But then again, we that's regarding any polarized issue, right? But we can have a opinion, let's say, about okay, what approach we feel better, right? Yeah, I'm pretty sure you have an opinion of, okay, how can we tackle fake news?
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
And so do I. And my overarching like if you say it's my opinion that like there are 2 ways. If you actually see all the research in fake news on how to combat fake news, more or less they can be classified along 2 dimensions. One is the epistemic dimension, another is the structural dimension, right?
Okay.
And the structural dimension is where you just fix the system, right? You fix the system, you fix the input of news, but that's to me that's very dangerous. And even that has been discussed in the literature, that doesn't bode well for the future trajectory of how news is going to look if you're trying to censor everything from the supply, right? And then the epistemic is where you the whole idea is you empower people who are consuming the news. You empower them in some way to do a better job. And I'm more, my opinion is that that's definitely more difficult, but also more sustainable. If we can have interventions that actually helps people to consume news better, that I'm all for that.
Yeah.
That's my motivation, primary motivation for these fake news and news research.
Okay. So this will give us a good way to pivot towards more to the domain that you're studying, right? We talked about the fact that I'm very kind of focused on the fake news realm, but you're also focused on the, okay, it brings up the bigger question of, well, what is news? But before we get there, I just want to point out one thing. You talked about the epistemic versus the structural approach. There's also perhaps this is a 2x2, and you have a top-down versus bottom-up approach. And you can bin the different proposed interventions into one of those four quadrants. There's going to be a strong correlation, I suspect, between the structural and top-down, kind of a little bit by construction, but also by the leverage points where there would be intervention. You talk about what some would say is quality control screening. I don't know if I believe that, but some people would make that argument. But some sort of screening on the front end, or some sort of dial turning or lever throwing on the amplification side. This whole freedom of speech, not freedom of reach thing, which people, is gaining popularity in various circles. You do wonder about the listener's right to hear, in that situation. But the next part about that is, I also agree. I think that, you talk about the epistemic approach, and to the extent I would focus on the bottom up, but the things where you empower users to be more discerning, and to, in a way that you preserve pluralism, you allow for emergent news players, people with just, a GoPro or an iPhone or an Android, right? And they go to some protest and they can report right there on the ground. There's no, overarching bureaucratic structure that's screening their stuff. There's no editorial board necessarily. Not that those things serve no purpose, but they certainly do. But in any case, I'm very interested in those potential solutions as well. That's one of the things I think is most interesting about the implications of some of Rand and Pennycook's work. They talk about the fact that perhaps people have overstated the role of confirmation bias. To be sure, we're more likely to believe news that confirms what we believe already, right? But at the same time, they talk about, we think about social media anyways, kind of this hedonic engagement for many people, or at least not a very mindful engagement. And they talk about, well, cognitive reflection. Like, if you can be in a cognitively reflective state while using social media, you greatly reduce the ability of someone to deceive you, to go back to your deception point. It's like you become a better BS detecting instrument as a person. And it's like, well, that's probably, there may be system level things you can do to help that, but the goal is not to suppress information. The goal is to empower the user. And those are different paradigms meaningfully.
And like empowering, and that's where, why some of the interventions don't seem to work, because it's so difficult. And it's interesting you mentioned something called hedonic. That has been mentioned in a lot of literature. That's one of the core problem. And sorry, I'm trying to, because you mentioned that, I just trying to tie something that I'm looking into in my research is like, what do you think of news as a product? What type of, if you had to classify news as a product, what would that be?
Oh, you're flipping the table. Ooh,
Yeah.
buddy. Okay, so let me not make too big a fool of myself. Well, if I do, it's okay. I'm actually not that concerned about it. But let's I've got a paper that is, and actually it's the one you've seen, but it's the part you don't focus on really during a conference presentation, where you're trying to develop the logic of your paper. And so we talk about it from an information economics point of view. And we contrast, physical goods to information. By the way, we're definitely not the first people to do this, like not even remotely. But there are important dimensions along which information goods differ from many physical goods. And I would consider news to be an information good. I think that's pretty inarguable. Though I'd be happy, if you can convince me otherwise, that'd be fascinating. And so we look at the, very crudely, we look at the production, the distribution / propagation, the use and consumption, intermediaries, externalities, and because we were studying information warranties. We also look at the warranty mechanism. So we look at these, we compare them across these 6 dimensions. So again, very quickly, because it's not the central focus of the paper, but it's enough to get us to the point of we can bring an economic game, we can bring a game theory model to this problem. And for this paper, we're looking, as Syed was quick to point out at the conference, we're looking at a sliver of fake news. And this is the fake news that is knowably true or false at the time of production, and that has economic implications. So like that's greatly constraining what we can say. But we think that for that type of news, this model might be informative. So you asked me, what do I think about fake news as a product, or I'm sorry, news as a product?
News as a product.
Yes, I would say it's an information good. Do you want me to say more than that?
No, I just wanted to hear your take on it, because I remember you had conceptualized, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it. And I just want to pivot back, but information goods, right? That's makes perfect sense. Right, that makes perfect sense. And and like, people have used different terms in the literature, but it gets to the same part. Like one of the terms is like it's a credence good, because like, for example, you consume news out of trust, right? You don't know, you can never know what the quality is. You just trust the quality is good, right? So that's why some say that it's a credence good.
Okay.
And the more I dig deeper, it's not from the literature, but I had done some qualitative interviews and sort of just talk to people on how they consume news. And again, I'm talking about news only on social media, because if I remember correctly, your information good, your conceptualization of information good was bounded by the context. I'm again using the word context.
Yeah, it's okay.
Is the economic information, is the was it the financial?
It has economic implications. Yeah.
Economic implications, right? So I'm talking about just all the everything that someone sees or someone perceives it to be news on. So I'll use social media as an extreme case.
Sure.
Like, everything that you see on social media. So to me, it seems like, okay, is this an experience product?
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
Like, because you say that, you get hedonic enjoyment out of it, right? And hedonic, it's predominantly associated with experience goods. And when you are on social media, for you, it's an experience, or I mean, for a general population, they get hedonic value out of it. One can claim, and news is just a part of it. There are a lot of other content, and that's where also the problem is, that news is intermixed with so many other type of contexts, other type of contents, that how do you know what news is? Like, how do you capture, okay, how is news different than a funny cat video, right?
Sure.
How are news competing with that, right? And how do you study that? So I'm trying to open up something, like trying to study, okay, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right. What type of product is it? And looking at the value people get out of. So when you talk about experienced product, there's this 2 dimension, utilitarian value and the hedonic value, right? There are other dimensions, but these 2, it tends to capture the broad values people get out of an experience. So I'm trying to get at that. Like, what value does news give to you? What value does the time someone spends on news, what do they get from it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's probably different for different people, I would imagine, maybe. And you're right, I do think there's probably some differences between those who primarily get their news through social media versus other sources. Though, I hear my advisor in my head, and we'll get into this because this relates to your research on news diets and that kind of stuff. I had mentioned, hey, I try and treat very crudely, because it's not, I'm not managing it like I'd manage a monetary portfolio, but I try and treat my news diet like an information portfolio. And so what does that mean? It's like, well, okay, well, I want to make sure I diversify so I'm not over leveraged on any single or correlated source or sources. So I do think that there's a, you talked about the utilitarian versus hedonic. How useful is it to me versus how much do I enjoy it? There are people that I literally have a Twitter or an X list, I guess, at this point called Information Portfolio. It's 300 members long. And there are people on there, not because I think that they're the sharpest minds, but because I appreciate how they talk about things. And I don't, the question you're asking is like, how do we properly conceptualize news products? It's probably an easier question for, the director at the New York Times, because like they have to map that onto subscriptions, right? Or ad sales. But for researchers trying to study this in, kind of a conceptual map or a nomological network or whatever term we prefer, it's a really hard question. And I don't think I have a good answer for you. I couldn't answer it probably for myself, really. I think that I view news as an information good, and that I view news as that which helps keep you informed for either action you'll take in the world or because it satisfies some desire to know.
Right. And I mean, that's the ideal definition of news, I would say. Right? If we lived in an ideal world of news production, that's the desirable way. And I hope people, I mean, if everyone cannot express it like you, but people who are good consumers of news probably would think of news as an information good.
Yeah. And I think people, my impression is that the general populace is more wise than perhaps they're given credit for by people with advanced degrees sometimes. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but there's this perception anyway. And I think we have some evolved heuristics that are pretty good. They survived many tens of thousands of years, or over the course of evolutionary history, recent evolutionary history, and they've helped us navigate more tumultuous times than we are now, both in the natural world as well as the the world of kinetic interface between peoples. So I think that I'm much more comfortable with saying something like, well, if someone can say it poetically, great. But if they can't say it poetically, but they still know it in their bones, that's also good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So for your research, we talked about news. We had a brief, chat beforehand to talk about, the goings on in life and that kind of thing. So can you tell me, one, just navigate me from, you said you originally had some interest in fake news, and then what brought you to the broader news question overall, and then maybe give us like one or two examples of the types of problems that you think, okay, these are on my plate and I'll have something important to say about them in the next, either now or in the next, 12 to 18 months.
Well, yeah, that's I don't know about the timeline, but
Okay.
yes. So for fake news, I mean, I was a young PhD student, and I tried to mostly study, okay, what can we do about it, right? What interventions can we look into? And like for my when I was almost in third year, I was sparked by this article I'm trying to remember, was it Harvard HBR or an article on Wall Street Journal, but they referenced academic work, is this concept of fast and frugal heuristics, right? So if you read fake newspapers, you see like, okay, why heuristics is problematic,
Hmm.
right? On why people fall for fake news. And then while I was reading this article, they talk about this concept of fast and frugal heuristics, where you actually train people to apply heuristics, but to be more accurate and more efficient.
Okay.
And there has been, and this is not the fast and frugal heuristics. The concept is not in news per se. There is, I'm trying to actually remember the name of the institute in Germany, and the scientist is good. It's difficult for me to pronounce his name. Gisenhenger.
Okay.
So they actually, so he has been doing this. He has a lot of publications on fast and frugal heuristics, where he'll he looked at, okay, if you make managerial decisions, how can you apply fast and frugal heuristics? And he compared those to predictive models, and always found that when you actually apply fast and frugal heuristics, they tend to be as accurate as more complex predictive models, and also obviously more efficient, right? And that has been so one of the I read about that, and I thought, okay, how can we twist this for fake news? And there was one article that looked into training high school students on how to uh, just do Google search. Like if they see a news, how do you do Google search, and how do you pick out signals, different signals to find, okay, is this news reliable? Is this news trustworthy?
Okay.
Right? And they train them over a few months, and then after that, they did that experiment, and they found that the students who actually got the training, they got better at detecting fake news, right? So I was like, okay, how can this come into play in a in a in a social media context where you don't have 1 month to train people, right?
Okay.
How can you nudge them, right? And so I'm still finalizing the manuscript, and what we did was we designed sort of a simple decision tree that can help you look at signals. Like, okay, uh, there are sometimes there are these signals that shows you, okay, is this picture photoshopped, right? Or does this look at the some of the news logos, right? Those can be copied, and how to look closely into the name of the source, right? Sometimes the sources look very similar to a credible news source. So very simple, very simple nudges, I would say, or very simple information on how to apply those techniques. And we did that on an online platform, done some experiments, and I just need to do more studies to validate that. But
Okay.
so far, the initial study we did find that people who got the treatment did better at identifying fake news, even after controlling for their confirmation bias.
Sure. Great. Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but again, as I had, told you earlier, that our findings are limited by context,
Sure.
and we need to do robustness and see where they stand. Yeah.
Where's so that's actually really interesting. I'll be sure to include a link to this this research body in the artifact. I really like this idea of fast and frugal. The inventory for right, you had to provide some set of fake news, some set of real news. And I don't want to take us backwards in our conversation, but I'm curious where those repositories came from.
So I actually, I wanted to limit it to a topic.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to some reports on like what are the most polarizing issues in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I picked one of them
Okay.
and I searched news articles
Mm-hmm.
on, uh, like collected a bunch of news articles, and there are platforms like AdFunds, Media, NewsGuard. They read the sources. I know there are criticism against them, right?
Yeah.
But that's a one way to start, and then I have other people who are looking at. I have other PhD students who are either have some experience of fake news, or as a PhD students, we can inform them what we're trying to achieve. And I have a few students who read those articles
Okay.
on how biased they are, how reliable they are. And what I did was I created this mixed pool of biased articles, and also let's say I have news on the right that are right leaning, and so there'll be 3 articles of one that's reliable, one that's not as reliable, and one that's less reliable, right?
Okay.
So that way, to keep the pool balanced, I try
Interesting.
to balance it by reliability and bias.
Okay. And the reliability came from like an assessment from like NewsGuard, is that right? Or was this derived?
Along with yes, I use those data along with rating by experts.
Okay.
By experts, I mean other PhD students.
Your peers, yeah.
Independently.
Right, of course.
I didn't give them and then we did
Okay.
some reliability test. It's not perfect, but it's just we have to.
But the
do
alternative is
best.
not to study the problem, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, I'm with you. I appreciate that I mean, that's a lot. I know that was a lot of work. So like that, kudos on that. The other thing, I had a professor tell me at one point, I was trying to make a case for why I wanted to study fake news, and they go, yeah, it's really interesting, but it seems like it's too immature of a phenomenon to study. And I thought, well, yeah, I actually do agree with you. I think it's too emergent. We don't have our bearings, even on the fundamentals. But the issue is that not everyone believes that, and there are a lot of people who are already studying this, and we're overrepresenting their perspectives on the state of fake news and interventions and consequences, all that kind of stuff, because they either do not have this concern about it being too new, or they care more about something else. And, doing the research, the authority that comes with being an expert on whatever information maladies, fake news, whatever you want to say. Okay, well, that's awesome. So that's cool. And then maybe talk a little bit about your kind of broader interest in news as a research topic.
Yes. So now, like the example that I gave you, and I think I'll piggyback on what you were just discussing, that okay, fake news is not a mature topic, and this is something I mentioned earlier, that the more I studied fake news and the more I read the articles, and then I look back at, I read like some of the older articles on what is news, what does news mean for society, what's the purpose of news, and when I try to compare them, I feel like, okay, maybe we are missing something here. That is, the fake news is probably a symptom of a bigger problem. And the problem is the definition of news have changed. What is news? The fundamental nature of news have changed, because we used to, I mean, again, I'm not, there are journalistic norms of how news is to be created, right? You used to have these institutions, again, not perfect, but there were certain norms that they needed to follow, certain values that they needed to uphold, right?
Mhm.
And then when the gates opened,
Mhm.
it's good. Now a lot of people, all of us have access to news, but
Mhm.
then you don't have norms, you don't have established practices, then anything can be news, right?
Mhm.
And if you look at like some of the, like there's so many definitions of news, but the simple one, but also sort of applies that it's an account of an interesting event, right?
Okay.
Of a recent interesting and significant event, right? It
There.
has to be, there is some sort of recency involved, and also it has to be interesting and significant,
Mhm.
and also it's an event, right? It's a reporting on an event.
Mhm.
And that is even like, even when you have those norms and practices, right?
Mhm.
It's a it's a loose definition. Anything can be news, and now we all know based on our experience that anyone can create news.
Mhm.
Any content can be easily packaged as news. And
Right.
when you look at also the financial model that have changed, right?
Mhm.
So all you need to do is have clickbaits. You
Mm.
make your news newsworthy, and you're fine. That gives you the incentive to pursue clickbaits and not real
Mhm.
news reporting. And like, before we had these digital platforms, there were still some checks and balances going on, right? There were still the newspapers could still be made accountable, and again, not perfect,
Of course.
right?
Yeah.
Yes.
What would you give as an example of account? No, I'm not asking for an incident, though you can use that if that's helpful. But what would that accountability look like to you
uh,
historically?
so um, one thing is readership,
Mhm.
right? If a newspaper has historically, if uh, they lose their creditworthiness, right? Their trustworthiness, people are not going to trust, and that's how the revenues are probably going to fall, and the readership is going to fall. I'm trying to remember if I can think of a specific example of how uh, how a news publisher
Mhm.
had to face it, right?
Right.
Uh, but the market mechanism was still there, right?
Right. Yeah. At
It
least
it it, it
theoretically. Right.
was
Yeah.
yes, I'm talking about the theoretical
Yeah.
implications.
I got you.
Yes, yes, and but now, it's a good thing, right? You want, I mean, conceptually, you want democratization of that process, right? You don't want um, people sitting in ivory tower just like you want democratization of the information you get,
Mhm.
but at the same time, uh, who does the quality check,
Right.
right? Who becomes the custodian
Mhm.
of what information we get? Because uh, we have limited capacity to process information,
Mhm.
bounded rationality,
Mhm.
right? Information overload.
Mhm.
And in that, we are only going to consume news that we find appealing. And somehow, all of us, even like I do it, I'm pretty sure you do it, we filter the type of, like for me, I use several tools to filter the news I get,
Mhm.
right? And that's biased by my preferences, right? Now, my preferences are I want to get a balanced news,
Mm.
right? And it, individuals can filter, or have no filter. It's other people doing the filtering for them,
Mhm.
right? And mm, so I think we're in this period of transition
Yep.
where we really need to look into what are the implications of just that how news have changed,
Mhm.
or you know, okay, previously, there were certain ways the news, even the language was, there was certain structure to how the news is structured,
Mhm.
right? So what type of topics that are being presented, and how has that, let's say, how the structure of news have changed
Right.
now, if you want to compare, and what
Mhm.
does that mean for how people consume news, and what implications it has. Like if you look at, like, historically, news serves the purpose of agenda setting, priming. Like it says, okay, what's the national agenda for you, right? Or for your nation, or for our nation, and same thing globally, right? It says the agenda on moving forward, and it also it nudges you to think about an issue in a certain way.
Yeah, it raises the
Now,
salience of it.
yes, and well, you can argue that it's good to have multiple perspectives now. We don't have a few concentrated institutions that are setting the agenda,
Mhm.
that are telling me what issues are more important. I'm all for it,
Mhm.
but then we also need to have a system that works.
Right, right. Yeah. So I'm with you that there's a tension, not strictly linear, but
Yeah,
some tension between an ungated information environment and a functional information environment. And I think you're right. I think that the fake news phenomenon, which we will not sufficiently bound here today, that likely what has happened and become more salient in the last, let's say, 9 years, is that people were saying, hey, there's some dysfunction in media. And as new players entered, there was increased ability to raise the salience about this dysfunction in the ongoing state, which then I think some people have used as a rationale to say, well, kind of to hell with it all. It doesn't matter if it's some person with a cat profile picture, 3 followers on Twitter who made an account yesterday, or it comes from the Wall Street Journal. It's all information. It's like, yeah, it is all information to be sure, but well, it's at least data, let's say. But that doesn't mean you should weight them equally. But I don't view my role to tell you which to weight more. I think it's somewhat self-evident. I think you're right about the credence perspective and the idea that news organizations evolve a reputation, news personalities evolve a reputation, and that there has to be an accountability mechanism. Otherwise, if there's no accountability mechanism, if we're just ordaining an oligopoly of news content providers, there's no corrective. And we can say that we're doing quality control because we're not allowing for pluralism or whatever else, right? Mis, dis, malinformation, whatever we want to say, propaganda. But is that really what you're doing? Or are you really just selecting for the type of information that you want? And the rubric, you use 2 different rubrics for that type of information. And I'm talking more, again, at the systems or legal infrastructure level. At the individual level, there's filtering. You mentioned filtering, and I told you I have this X list. I also have an add-in in my browser for ground news. They use all sides media bias
I've
rating.
used.
Yep. Um, by the way, by the time this episode comes out, my previous episode with the director of, I think it's like news ratings and marketing at All Sides will be out. So I spoke to her about media bias pretty extensively. She was Julie Masterini. She's very insightful. And but I'm curious what other tool, to the extent you're willing to share, because this kind of, I know actually we're running out of time, but this kind of brings me to the other big question I want to make sure I ask everyone on this podcast, which is, what advice would you give people for how to be more informed in the current media landscape? Could be some of the tools you're using. It could be other tips or techniques you've taken from the literature or that you just find compelling. What would you say?
Well, I use 2 heuristics.
Okay.
Uh, one would be, if I read an article
Mhm.
about about especially something that is a polarizing topic,
Mhm.
I'll immediately search, okay, what does that, okay, let's say I read something that is probably more right-leaning or left-leaning.
Hmm.
I'll search and I'll see, okay, what does the news on the other side has to say about this?
Hmm.
And I try to pick apart or see the commonalities and the differences
Hmm.
between the type of information they have presented, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the same information, but just packaged differently,
Yeah.
right? Because they're catering to different audiences, right? But if you spend enough time, you can filter out the subjectivity
Hmm.
out of it and just get the facts.
Yep.
That's one of the heuristics I
Okay.
use. And then I also look at uh, uh, like, reputed rating platforms,
Hmm.
right? And by now I know which are the top news sources.
Hmm.
But like, in my search, if I find something that's not that I don't know or I haven't seen before, I'll probably look at one of the sites, right? Like something like AdFons, NewsGuard, and yeah.
Okay. So you're saying if you come across something on X, I don't know if you're on X, but let's say you're on X, and you're like, huh, I don't recognize this news organization. That's kind of an interesting story. What you'll then do is you'll say, okay, well, I have a list of whatever 30 top news sources from NewsGuard, let's say. I'm going to see if they're saying something about it. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good heuristic.
Yeah.
Um,
And also sometimes I'll just go into the source itself because you can see what are the other type of news that they have
mhm,
posted about, and you can compare. Some of it might be knowledgeable, and you might be able to see, oh, okay, I think this is reliable, or I think this is not reliable.
mhm,
And but end of the day, it also comes down to are you we're deeply interested in the phenomena, right? So we spend
right.
time, even we personally invest time. So I spend time on for research, right? I need to stay updated on what's going on, and also for my own personal
Mhm,
interests. I read news, right?
mhm,
And so I spend a lot of time,
mhm,
but I know, and I that a regular person would not, right? And I'm trying to remember the article, but it was probably uh, uh, or I don't remember the journal, but this is a list of authors that look at media literacy,
mhm,
and they had a very interesting finding was that people who have a high media literacy,
mhm,
they tend to do a good job of identifying fake news. No surprise there,
mhm,
but they also spend more time engaging with news. They spend less time engaging with news. It's the people who are low on the media literacy,
mhm.
they tend to spend more time engaging with news on social media.
Hmm.
And again, I think that paper was from 2018, and uh, it was survey-based research. Uh, I'd like to know how things stand, but based on even now, sometimes when I talk to people uh, who I assume, who I know for sure that they are very uh, like we know people who are highly accomplished in
Mhm,
research and who are very objective in the way they look into things,
mhm.
right? But I know there are a lot of people who are highly objective, but they don't, because they're like, oh, that's toxic. News is toxic now,
Yeah, right,
right?
right.
So they don't stay informed about
Mhm.
the news, and they don't join the conversation.
Yeah.
And uh, who are low on media literacy sometimes tend to drive conversation on certain issues, and that's problematic. I see that as problematic, and maybe we do need responsible consumers to be more engaged with
Yeah.
news.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue that there's maybe some annual media literacy training that, as meta, that you say, hey, here's a 10-minute, like, kind of webinar type thing. You could certainly do this as an experiment on, company side, but you could do this as a platform itself and say, hey, we think that this will be a kind of an organic way we can improve the information processing, the signal processing on our platform without having like a heavy-handed approach, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Syed, this has been fascinating. I've only gone 4 minutes over. I'm getting better at this whole thing. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up? Is there, some people want to be searchable and discoverable outside of just a podcast episode. So if you have any social media or any projects you want to plug, feel free. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation, and I learned so much. And I need to uh, listen to your next. You said you'll be releasing one soon.
Mm-hmm.
I look forward to listening to that. And regarding fake news, I mean, to be honest, I hope that over the years, as a society, we find a solution that is sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll try my best, and I'm interested and passionate about the topic, and hopefully, stand on the shoulders of the giants and make some contribution in that regards. But yes, absolutely fascinating experience, just working on it and even talking to people who are passionate about the topic. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's great, Syed. Thank you again. As I mentioned to you before we jumped on the recorded version of the podcast, you seem like someone who's interested in research for all the right reasons. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a win. I'm glad to have another person who is like that, interested in news media, digital platforms, and the interface between the two. So until next time, folks, stay honest, stay rigorous, and keep speaking freely. From Is to Ought is a Freedomcast Network production. Be sure to join us next time, where we dive into the construct validity or potential lack thereof around fake news, its operationalizations, and interrogate how this problem is studied in an attempt to recover a frame for understanding the competing narratives around this important issue.